The blizzard came early that year, burying the valley in 10 feet of snow and toppling every cabin for miles, except one. The man who built it had been laughed at for his cube-shaped fortress, but he knew something they didn't. This winter would be unlike any other. Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. And if you love stories of frontier survival and invention, you're in the right place. The first snowfall arrived early, falling like a heavy curtain over the valley, blanketing the surrounding mountains in a sheet of relentless white. It wasn't the kind of storm that would pass in a few hours. No, this one was deep and violent, the kind that made old log cabins creak and bend under its weight. By the time the storm had fully set in, it had already buried the town's tiny cluster of homes beneath a thick blanket of snow. Some roofs had already buckled, others were cracking under the strain. The once vibrant community was now silent except for the gusts of wind that howled through the trees and the occasional sound of timber snapping. Elias Merritt sat inside his cabin, staring out the small window at the blizzard's fury. He was an older man, weathered by the years of survival and failure, with a life built on hard lessons in the harshest landscapes. He had seen storms like this before, but what made this one different was that his cabin was still standing. In fact, it had never looked sturdier. Unlike the other buildings around him, which groaned and shook with every gust, his cube-shaped structure sat confidently against the mountainside, its angular walls cutting through the wind like a stubborn stone. He had designed it with the storms in mind, each joint and log carefully chosen for its durability. There would be no collapse here, no fear of a roof coming down on his head. The other cabins were a different story. One by one, the roofs of nearby cabins had begun to sag, their structures unable to withstand the pressure of the snow. Neighbors had scrambled to the safety of Elias's cabin, seeking refuge from the storm that was sure to destroy them. They had once mocked him for building such an odd structure, a coffin on stilts, they called it. But now, as Elias watched them trudging through the snow with no shelter of their own, his strange fortress looked more like a sanctuary. He heard the familiar sounds of cracking timbers in the distance, the last sign of a cabin being overwhelmed by the storm's force. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold seep into his bones. This wasn't just another storm, this was a reckoning, and as the winds howled and snow continued to fall relentlessly, Elias Merritt knew one thing for sure: his cabin was the only one that would survive. 6 months earlier, Elias Merritt had arrived alone at the town of Blackstone, a small mining settlement nestled between the jagged peaks of the Montana Rockies. His cart was heavy with supplies: iron rods, squares, nails, rolled canvas, and all the other materials he would need to build his cabin, a cabin that would become the talk of the town. The townsfolk had eyed him curiously when he first arrived. He was a stranger, a man whose weathered face and rough hands spoke of someone who had lived through far more than a simple prospector's life. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught their attention. It was his strange plan to build a cabin unlike anything they had ever seen before. Elias's plan was as simple as it was radical. He would build a cube, a structure with 4 equal-length walls, angled for strength and stability, raised off the ground by sturdy stilts. The town had been built on tradition, each cabin following the same crude blueprint, a small wooden frame with a slanted roof and walls that were prone to settling and shifting. The cabins were functional enough, but none had ever been tested by the kind of storms that often ravaged the valley. As Elias began his work, the locals took notice, but not for the right reasons. They laughed at the man who wanted to build a box in a place that demanded adaptability, flexibility, and a degree of improvisation. A few whispered that Elias had grown too old for the rough life of the mountains, and perhaps his mind had begun to wander as his body aged. They teased him for being a fool, convinced that the storms would prove his methods wrong. In the winter, when snow piled higher than anyone had seen, Elias's cube would be crushed, just like all the other buildings. But Elias wasn't worried. He had spent enough time in the wilderness to know the secrets of survival. He wasn't building a cabin for convenience or comfort. He was building one to survive the kind of freeze that had been known to collapse entire communities. Each day he worked methodically, cutting logs with a steady hand and creating his square frame with precise measurements. It took him longer than most, but that was part of his plan. Every cut, every joint, every nail was deliberate. Nothing could be left to chance. This cabin wouldn't just withstand the cold, it would challenge it. As the last of the logs were set in place, the locals gathered from their homes, standing at a distance to watch the final touches of the strange cube-like cabin. They were certain Elias's obsession would fail, and they made sure he knew it. But Elias just smiled quietly to himself. His work was far from over, and soon the storm would reveal the truth of his design. Elias Merritt had never been a man to talk much about his past, but the scars on his hands, the calluses on his palms, and the deep lines etched into his face spoke volumes. Each mark, each knot of muscle told a story of survival. His hands had gripped the earth and the tools of mining for decades, but it wasn't the labor that had shaped him. It was the tragedy that had come with it. Years before arriving in Blackstone, Elias had worked the silver mines in the far reaches of Colorado. He had been a young man then, full of ambition and driven by the dream of striking it rich. His crew had been a good one, a tight-knit group of men who shared everything, from the hardships of the mine to the hopeful dreams of wealth. But that dream was shattered one cold winter's evening when a cave-in claimed the lives of 3 of his closest friends. The collapse had come suddenly, with no warning. One moment they were digging deep into the mountain's veins. The next, the world around them collapsed in an avalanche of rocks and dirt. The earth groaned, then fell silent. Elias had managed to escape, crawling through a narrow crevice just as the mountain's wrath closed in behind him. But the men he had worked beside, the men he had trusted, were lost. The pain of that night stayed with him, the sense of helplessness, the suffocating weight of the rock pressing down on those he couldn't save. And in the aftermath, as he made his way back to the surface, Elias had sworn that he would never be caught unprepared again. He spent the following years on a solitary path, never again trusting the instability of temporary shelters. No more dirt floors, no more slanted roofs, no more fragile walls that could collapse under the slightest pressure. If he was going to build anything again, it would be strong. It would be something that would stand when everything else crumbled. When he arrived in Blackstone, he found a community of miners living in houses built hastily, with no thought to their longevity. It reminded him too much of the old mining town he had left behind. And so, he set out to build his fortress, a place that could withstand more than just the elements, a structure that could survive anything, just as he had. The memory of the cave-in haunted him as he worked. The weight of the snow wasn't the only thing that pressed down on him. Every log he cut, every nail he hammered, was a defiant answer to the mountain that had once tried to bury him. He wasn't building just to survive another storm. He was building to ensure that no one else would have to face the crushing weight of an unexpected collapse again. As Elias stood in the midst of his nearly completed cabin, he surveyed the structure with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It was unlike any cabin the town had ever seen, a perfect cube, raised off the ground, its walls as strong and straight as the mountain itself. To most of the townsfolk, it was an absurdity, a stubborn oddity that clung to the landscape like a stone relic from some far-off world. But to Elias, it was a triumph of logic, born of necessity and shaped by his years of experience. He had designed it not just for shelter, but for resilience. The structure was simple, almost mathematical in its precision. The 4 walls, each the same length, were arranged in such a way that the pressure of snow and wind would be evenly distributed across the entire cabin. No single point would bear the full weight. No roof would sag or collapse. The cube's uniform shape eliminated the vulnerabilities of traditional cabins, with their slanted roofs and shifting foundations. In nature, things that stood straight and strong weathered the storms best. It was a principle Elias had seen in the mines, tunnels built to stand up to the mountain's weight, not bend under it. But it wasn't just the shape that made this cabin unique. Elias had spent weeks thinking about every detail. The cabin rested on sturdy wooden stilts, elevated above the snow and frozen earth, preventing the shifting of the ground from destabilizing the structure. The stilts were angled, too, to ensure that they would hold steady against the freezing and thawing of the earth and the natural movement of snow as it melted and refroze. The joints of the cube were pinned together with iron rods, a technique Elias had seen used in industrial buildings back east. Most log cabins were built by simply notching the logs and stacking them, but Elias's construction eliminated the weak points created by notching. Each log extended past the corners of the cabin, overlapping by 2 feet, and was held together by iron pins, driving the logs into a rigid, unyielding pattern. The structure was far stronger than the typical log cabin, and Elias knew that it could withstand the weight of snow, ice, and even the heavy winds that howled through the valley. His choice of materials was just as deliberate. The walls were coated with a mixture of pine resin and oil-soaked canvas, not for warmth, but to preserve the logs and keep moisture out. Traditional cabins suffered from rot when exposed to the elements, but Elias knew that his cabin would last much longer if he could prevent water from seeping into the wood. The canvas also reflected heat back into the cabin, helping maintain a stable temperature inside. Every element, every detail of the cabin's design was a reflection of Elias's philosophy: build not for comfort, but for survival. He was determined to create a place where no storm, no freezing cold, no shift in the earth could destroy what he had built. As he stood back and looked at the cube, he knew that he had succeeded. The storm would come, and it would come hard. But his cabin would stand tall, just as he had, unyielding and resolute against whatever nature had to throw at it. Elias had been meticulous in every aspect of his cabin's design, but nothing was more critical than the foundation. When he had first arrived in Blackstone, he had surveyed the land carefully, taking note of the snow patterns, the shifting frost lines, and the way the earth sank and shifted with the seasons. Most of the cabins in town were built directly on the ground, their foundations sinking or shifting as the snow melted and the frost receded, but Elias knew that would never do for his cube. He needed a foundation that could withstand the brutal weight of winter snow, the thawing and freezing of the earth, and the pressure of the storm's winds. The answer was simple, though unconventional. Elias raised his cabin up on sturdy stilts perched high above the snow. The idea came from a long-forgotten lesson learned in the old mining town. When a mine shaft collapsed, the earth had swallowed whole buildings, but one structure, a blacksmith shop built high on stone pillars, had remained intact. The foundation had absorbed the pressure of shifting earth and remained strong. Elias had never forgotten that lesson, and he carried it with him into the mountains. Building the foundation of his cube took weeks, far longer than any traditional cabin would have required. First, Elias dug a shallow trench around the perimeter of the cabin, ensuring the base was level and compacted. He then filled the trench with rocks, each stone carefully placed and compacted into the earth to create a solid base. The rocks would act as a buffer, preventing the weight of the snow from shifting the stilts and allowing the cabin to settle without the threat of sinking. The stilts themselves were made of thick, straight logs, each cut to the same length, each supported by heavy cross-bracing. The structure was anchored to the earth as if it were a small fortress, elevated far enough above the snow to avoid the destructive force of the freeze. As Elias worked, the townsfolk watched from a distance, some curious, others dismissive. It wasn't that they didn't understand his reasoning, but the concept of building so high off the ground seemed impractical to them. They had seen people build cabins for years without worrying about foundations. Their homes had stood the test of time, or so they thought. The thought of raising a cabin like this so high above the earth seemed unnecessary. But Elias was undeterred. The storm was coming, and he was determined to be prepared. When the foundation was complete, Elias stood back and examined his work. The stilts rose above the valley like the legs of a giant, and the cube structure was positioned perfectly atop the base, ready to face whatever the winter could throw at it. The foundation was strong, stable, and immune to the forces that would ravage the other cabins. Elias knew the townsfolk thought him mad for spending so much time on something so seemingly trivial, but he also knew that his foundation would be the one thing that stood when everything else crumbled. As the days turned to weeks and winter began to settle in over Blackstone, Elias continued working on his cabin with a quiet, determined focus. The locals, though, were a different story. They watched his progress with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. At first, they whispered behind his back, exchanging jokes about the madman building a coffin in the snow. As his cube-shaped structure slowly took form, they began to mock him openly. "That thing looks like a box for a dead man," one miner joked, his voice loud enough for Elias to hear as he worked. "Hope he's got enough space to bury himself in it." Elias merely smiled in response, never letting their words bother him. He knew that their laughter was born from a mixture of ignorance and fear. Fear of the unknown, of doing things differently. Most of them had spent their lives building the same kind of cabins their fathers had built before them, and the idea of changing anything felt like an affront to tradition. They had all lived through the seasons of snow and ice, and they had survived. Why then would they need a new way of building? But Elias understood something they didn't. He had seen what nature could do to a man's home, how the pressure of snow could crack timbers, how the weight of a storm could pull a cabin down into the earth. He had seen the ground shift and sink beneath the weight of winter, and he knew that a cabin built on the ground, with no thought to the movement of the earth beneath, was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. And so, Elias worked, day after day, focused on his design and the logic behind it. While the others mocked him, he paid no mind. He wasn't building for comfort or for aesthetics. He was building for survival. His cube would stand strong no matter how much snow fell or how violently the winds howled. One evening, as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, Elias sat inside his nearly finished cabin, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The roof was nearly complete, the walls were sealed, and the fire in the hearth crackled with warmth. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting lazily down to the earth. The storm was coming. Elias could feel it in the air. But even as the wind howled outside, even as the snow began to pile up in the valley, the townsfolk continued to laugh. They passed by his cabin on their way to their own homes, pointing and shaking their heads in disbelief. They couldn't understand. To them, Elias's cube was just another oddity, another eccentricity in a land full of rugged, stubborn men. But to Elias, it was his answer to the world that had once tried to crush him, a silent declaration that he would never again let nature dictate his fate. As the storm began to intensify, Elias pulled his fur-lined coat tighter around his shoulders and stoked the fire. He could hear the wind whipping outside, the howls of the storm growing louder. It was almost time for the world to test his creation, and he was ready. Elias Merritt had always been a man of practical solutions, and every choice he made in building his cube cabin reflected that ethos. His decision to coat the walls with canvas wasn't about warmth, nor was it a mere aesthetic choice. It was about preservation. The bitter winds and relentless snow that swept through the valley during winter could do far more than just freeze a man to his bones. They could rot the very walls that kept him safe. The town's traditional cabins, with their rough-hewn logs and moss-filled chinks, had a tendency to decay, particularly after a season or two of heavy snow. But Elias understood that moisture was the true enemy of wood. It wasn't just the cold, it was the wetness that seeped into the logs, causing them to warp, rot, and weaken under the pressure of repeated thawing and freezing. He had spent countless hours studying the materials around him. The canvas, which seemed like an odd choice to most, had been chosen carefully. It wasn't just any fabric. Elias had stretched and soaked it in pine resin, which he had boiled down in large vats, carefully mixing it with oil from the local wildlife. The result was a pliable, waterproof material that would protect the cabin from the snow and ice, while also keeping the moisture out. The application of the resin-soaked canvas onto the cabin's exterior took Elias days. He stretched the cloth tightly over the walls, securing it with wooden pegs and iron nails. As he worked, he took note of the small details that would make a difference when the storms came. He made sure the canvas was taut and smooth against the logs, leaving no room for water to collect and seep into the structure. Each seam was meticulously sealed with a mix of pine resin and clay, filling any gaps where the canvas overlapped or where the logs didn't meet perfectly. The resin-coated canvas served another purpose too. It acted as a reflective surface. Though the idea wasn't common knowledge in Blackstone, Elias had learned from the mining days that heat, even in small quantities, could make all the difference in surviving a harsh winter. The canvas reflected the warmth from his stove, ensuring that heat would stay inside the cabin, trapped within the walls, and creating a stable, livable environment. It was a simple but brilliant solution to the problem of the cold, one that would soon prove to be one of the key features of his cabin's resilience. As Elias finished the last stretch of canvas, he stood back and admired his work. The cube-shaped cabin, now fully wrapped in its protective covering, looked more like a fortress than a simple shelter. The seams were tight, the resin gleamed in the sunlight, and the cabin felt solid, as if it were already withstanding the elements. But Elias knew that this was just one step in a long series of preparations. The storm was coming, and the canvas would soon be put to the test. He spent the rest of the day securing his tools, double-checking the firewood, and preparing for what he knew would be the harshest winter Blackstone had seen in years. As the wind picked up that evening, Elias stood by the window, watching the first snowflakes begin to fall. The storm had arrived, and he was ready. The first storm of the season hit with a vengeance. By midday, the sky had darkened into a thick blanket of swirling clouds, and the temperature dropped drastically. Elias had been expecting it. He could feel the change in the air, the biting chill that signaled the beginning of winter. He had spent the last few days preparing for this moment, knowing that his cabin was about to be tested in ways no other shelter in Blackstone had been. As the wind began to pick up, Elias could hear it howling through the trees, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to carry across the valley. The snow came in flurries at first, then with increasing intensity, swirling and drifting in the air until the entire landscape was a blur of white. The snow was thick, heavy, and relentless, covering the ground quickly and burying the valley in its icy grip. From his small window, Elias watched as the other cabins around him began to bend under the weight of the storm. He had built his cabin to endure, but there was no way of knowing how it would stand up to this. The wind, the snow, and the freezing temperatures were forces beyond his control. All he could do was wait and watch and trust in the work he had done. As the hours passed, Elias listened to the sounds of the storm, the constant howling of the wind, and the occasional creaking of the trees as they swayed in the gale. He could hear the roofs of nearby cabins groaning and shifting under the weight of the snow, the sounds growing louder as the storm intensified. The town was eerily quiet except for the noise of the storm itself. It was as if the storm had swallowed everything whole. Elias sat by the fire, feeding the flames and keeping the stove stoked with dry pine logs. The warmth inside his cabin was a comforting contrast to the harsh conditions outside. He had spent years in the mountains, and he had learned how to keep a fire alive even in the coldest of conditions. He had also learned how to conserve fuel, ensuring that he would have enough to last through the worst of the storm. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The winds grew stronger, the snow continued to fall, and the temperature dropped even further. Elias knew that the storm would last for days, perhaps even longer. But he didn't worry. He had prepared. His cabin was holding firm, the canvas walls holding up against the onslaught of snow and wind. The resin-coated fabric held the heat inside, and the stove kept the cabin warm enough to endure the freezing cold outside. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Elias's cube, there was calm. The walls held firm, and the fire crackled steadily in the hearth. Elias sat back, watching the flames dance in the firelight, knowing that he had done what he needed to do to survive the storm. His cabin was standing strong, and he was ready for whatever the wilderness could throw at him next. As the wind howled outside and the snow piled higher against the cabin, Elias closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The storm had arrived, but his cabin was holding strong. It was built to last. It was built to survive. And so was he. The storm raged through the night, its fury unrelenting as it pounded the valley with snow and wind. Elias's cabin stood firm, its walls and foundations holding strong against the forces outside. Inside, the fire crackled merrily, casting a warm, golden glow on the walls as Elias sat near the hearth, silently watching the storm unfold through the narrow window. The snow had piled up against the walls, but the resin-coated canvas held firm, shedding the snow like water off a duck's back. Elias had always been a man who trusted in his work, but even he could not have foreseen just how powerful this storm would be. The wind howled like a wild beast, rattling the windows and shaking the walls, and the snow continued to fall in heavy, relentless sheets. As the hours passed, Elias could hear the sounds of the valley around him, the groaning of trees under the weight of snow, the distant cracking of other cabins, the occasional creak of a structure bowing under pressure. He had been in storms before, but this one felt different. It was as if the land itself was being tested. It wasn't until the dead of night that Elias heard the unmistakable sound of wood cracking. The sound was distant at first, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of the wind, but it grew louder, and soon Elias could hear the unmistakable sound of a cabin collapsing. The valley around him seemed to be coming alive with the sounds of breaking timber, the sharp crack of wood snapping under the weight of the snow. He stood up, his heart racing. He had heard this sound before, the sound of a cabin being overwhelmed. In his mind, he could see the homes of the townsfolk crumbling under the pressure, their roofs buckling, their walls collapsing. Elias quickly grabbed his coat and stepped outside into the storm, determined to help. The snow was thick and heavy, the wind stinging his face as he moved through the waist-high drifts. He could barely see a few feet ahead, but he knew where the other cabins were located. He had lived in this valley long enough to know the terrain. The wind howled around him, but he pressed on, moving as quickly as he could through the deep snow. It wasn't long before he reached the site of the first cabin. The structure had collapsed in on itself, the roof buckled and broken. The front door had been torn off its hinges, and debris was scattered across the yard. Elias immediately began digging through the snow and rubble, calling out for anyone who might be trapped inside. He found the family's father, unconscious but alive, buried beneath a pile of broken timbers. Elias worked quickly, pulling the man free and dragging him to safety. He didn't know how much time they had before the rest of the structure gave way. As he carried the injured man to his own cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. When he returned to his cabin, he couldn't help but glance around at the other structures in the valley. His was the only one still standing, the only one that hadn't buckled under the weight of the storm. The thought weighed on him heavily. His cabin had survived, but at what cost? As the storm wore on, Elias's cabin became an island of safety amidst the chaos of crumbling structures. Word of his fortress spread quickly through Blackstone, carried by the few survivors of the other cabins. They came to Elias's door seeking shelter, their faces pale from the terror of the storm and the collapse of their homes. Elias welcomed them in, offering warmth by the fire and whatever food he had left. By the time the storm had passed, nearly half the town had gathered at his cabin, either sheltering from the elements or awaiting word on the state of their homes. The sounds of creaking and snapping wood had gradually faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to weigh on everyone's shoulders. No one spoke about it directly, but they all knew that Elias's cabin had been the only one to survive. Elias didn't boast about his work, nor did he lecture them about the superiority of his design. He simply went about his tasks, maintaining his fire, securing food, and offering help where it was needed. But as the days passed and the storm's aftermath began to sink in, more and more people began to ask him questions. They were curious about the cube, about the strange structure that had withstood the storm. "How did you build it?" one of the survivors asked, his voice hoarse from the cold. Elias was in no mood for long explanations. He simply answered, "It's a matter of pressure distribution. The shape holds up to the weight of snow better than any slanted roof." Another man, a miner from a neighboring town, stepped forward. "You think it'll hold up again? The snow's just going to keep coming." Elias nodded. "It's built for it. The foundation is elevated to keep the snow from shifting it. And the walls, they're locked tight. The whole thing's designed to take pressure from all sides." Some of the survivors, skeptical at first, looked at each other, nodding slowly as the logic sank in. They were a practical people, and Elias had always been known for his resourcefulness. The way his cabin had withstood the storm was undeniable. Soon people began asking for specifics. How did Elias choose his logs? What materials had he used? What made his construction methods so different? Elias explained in simple terms. The logs were carefully chosen for their straightness and strength. He didn't rely on typical notched corners that could weaken over time. Instead, he pinned each corner with iron rods to distribute pressure evenly across the walls. The walls were coated in a layer of resin-soaked canvas, not just for warmth, but to protect the wood from moisture. Even the roof was built to withstand the weight of snow, each plank layered in a way that ensured no gaps would form. As the days passed, more people from Blackstone came to visit Elias's cabin, hoping to see for themselves how the cube had survived. Elias didn't mind the attention. In fact, he welcomed it. He wasn't trying to make a name for himself. He was simply trying to make sure people survived the next storm. By the time spring arrived, a few of the miners had already begun building their own cube cabins. They had learned from Elias's design and were eager to implement his methods, not just for their own safety, but to ensure the survival of their families. The town had changed, and Elias had unwittingly started a movement, one that would soon spread far beyond the reaches of Blackstone. As more cabins were built using Elias's methods, the valley began to look different. The town was becoming stronger, its foundations built to withstand whatever nature had in store. Elias had built his cabin to survive, but now it was doing something more. It was teaching others how to survive, and in doing so, it was changing the future of Blackstone, and the way its people would build for generations to come. The storm had left a lasting mark on Blackstone. The snow piled higher than anyone had ever seen before, and with it came the quiet despair of isolation. Supplies were running low. The town had always been resourceful, but a winter storm like this, so early and so fierce, left them with little more than what they could carry. By the time the worst of it had passed, much of the town's food had been buried under mounds of snow, unreachable and lost. Elias's cabin, with its solid foundation and resilient walls, became an island of safety for those who had nowhere else to turn. The survivors filtered in over the course of the following days, bringing with them whatever food they had left. Some had little more than a handful of flour or dried meat. Others had managed to salvage some potatoes and root vegetables from their buried gardens. But for all of them, the realization was the same. The storm had robbed them of their ability to provide for themselves, and survival now depended on working together. Elias had prepared for winter, as he always did, but he wasn't immune to hunger. His own food stores were dwindling fast. Still, he did not turn anyone away. His cabin was small, but he had built it to accommodate the few who needed shelter. As more people arrived, the room grew crowded, and the fire in the hearth had to be stoked more frequently to keep the growing number of bodies warm. The townsfolk who had once mocked Elias's cube now marveled at the warmth and safety it provided. Inside, the fire burned steady and bright, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The resin-coated canvas on the walls trapped the heat, keeping the temperature inside bearable even when the winds howled outside. It was clear to everyone that Elias's cabin was more than just a shelter from the snow. It was a symbol of resilience. As the days stretched on, food began to run out. The miners, trappers, and townsfolk who had taken refuge in Elias's cabin grew desperate. They couldn't just wait for spring to bring the thaw. They needed food now. Elias, however, had a quiet sense of confidence in the face of their growing panic. He had learned to hunt, to forage, and to survive off the land. While others fretted, Elias kept his mind focused on the problem at hand, how to feed the people who had come to rely on his shelter. One morning, after a night spent huddled around the fire, Elias bundled himself up in his furs and stepped outside. The snow was deep, but he had learned to navigate through it with careful steps. His goal was to find game, anything that would give the survivors the sustenance they desperately needed. He knew the terrain, knew where to look for tracks, and he set out with a quiet determination that had sustained him through many winters before. Hours later, Elias returned with a deer. Not a large one, but enough to feed everyone for several days. The group inside his cabin, too cold and too hungry to hunt for themselves, greeted him with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Elias didn't say much as he began to butcher the deer, but his actions spoke louder than words. The town had been brought to its knees by the storm, but with Elias's leadership, they were learning to survive. The deer would be enough for now, but Elias knew the coming weeks would test them all. The storm had been harsh, but the real struggle was just beginning. The storm had passed, but the cold had not. The wind continued to howl through the valley, and the snow remained thick on the ground, blocking trails and isolating the townsfolk in their homes. The cold seeped into everything, the wood, the walls, the bones of the miners who had spent long hours digging for gold, the trappers who had known the harshness of winter but had never seen it so severe. The warmth of Elias's cabin, however, was unlike anything they had experienced. The chimney inside Elias's cube cabin was a marvel in itself, far from the simple stone or brick chimneys that the other miners used. Most of the cabins in Blackstone relied on basic chimneys, which often became clogged with soot or froze shut when the temperature dropped too low. The fire would sputter and die, leaving the occupants in the cold, or they would have to constantly clear the chimney, risking smoke inhalation or worse. Elias, however, had thought about this problem long before the first snowflake had fallen. His chimney was built inside a second, wider chimney, lined with copper scraps he had collected over the years. He had learned from his mining days that copper could withstand the intense heat of a fire without warping or deteriorating. By using copper to line the interior of the chimney, he had ensured that the smoke could travel up without interference, and that the chimney itself would not freeze, even during the coldest months. The townsfolk marveled at it. The fire in Elias's cabin burned steadily, emitting a soft warmth that filled the small space without the choking smell of smoke. The heat from the stove radiated through the walls, creating an almost surreal comfort in the otherwise inhospitable cold. The chimney system worked so efficiently that Elias had no need to tend to it constantly. The smoke rose and escaped as it should, leaving the air inside the cabin fresh and clean, no matter how harsh the weather outside. Elias's chimney, like his cabin, was an example of his quiet ingenuity. While others focused on the immediate need for shelter and warmth, Elias had thought beyond the basic structure of his home. He knew that survival wasn't just about withstanding the cold. It was about making sure that the warmth you had would last, that it would endure through the worst the winter could throw at you. One evening, as the fire crackled and the townsfolk sat around the hearth, a miner named Cole asked Elias how he had managed to build such a perfect system. The question was simple, but it carried a deeper meaning. The miner had lived his entire life in the mountains, and yet he had never thought to build something as practical as Elias's cabin. "It's all about the air," Elias explained, staring into the flames. "The heat has to have a place to go, but it also has to stay. You need a chimney that won't freeze up, and walls that keep the heat from escaping. If you focus on the fundamentals, the rest takes care of itself." The others nodded, taking in his words. They had seen his cabin survive when others had crumbled, and now they were beginning to understand why. Elias had built not just for himself, but for everyone who had sought refuge under his roof. The chimney, the canvas-covered walls, the raised foundation. They were all part of a larger strategy, one that would ensure they could survive the winter together. That night, as the wind howled outside, Elias sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. The fire flickered and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls of his cabin. The storm might return tomorrow, but for tonight his work had kept the cold at bay. His cabin was still standing, and so was he. The wind howled through the valley like a wild beast, its icy fingers clawing at the walls of the cabins. But inside Elias Merritt's cube-shaped sanctuary there was warmth, the kind that kept the biting cold at bay. The fire crackled in the stove, sending orange light dancing across the room. The smoke from the chimney rose in a steady stream, disappearing into the night sky, leaving no trace of its presence inside. Elias sat by the fire, quietly feeding it with logs, his hands moving with practiced precision. He had built his stove himself, a simple yet efficient system that burned hotter and longer than most. He had learned through years of living in the wilderness that fire was the difference between life and death. A fire could warm the bones of a man trapped in a storm, and it could cook the food that kept hunger at bay. But fire could also kill if it was uncontrolled or improperly maintained. Elias had always been meticulous about tending the flame, knowing that it was the lifeblood of survival. The storm that had struck Blackstone was far from over, and Elias knew that the days ahead would test them all. The others, who had taken refuge in his cabin, sat huddled around the fire, grateful for its warmth, but equally aware of the dwindling supply of wood. It wasn't just the snow that posed a threat now, it was the lack of resources. The trees surrounding the town had been stripped bare, and the roads to the nearest town were impassable. Supplies of food and fuel were running dangerously low. Elias had always planned ahead, but even he hadn't anticipated this level of isolation. He had prepared for the cold, for the snow, but there was only so much one man could do. The fire was his main source of warmth, and he couldn't afford to let it go out. He had enough wood to last a few more days, but once that was gone, they would have to venture out into the storm, and he wasn't sure they would make it back. The thought of losing the fire haunted him. Elias had seen men die in the wild from simple mistakes, from letting their fire go out in the middle of a storm, from failing to keep themselves warm enough to survive. He wasn't about to let that happen to anyone here. As the wind howled louder outside, Elias stood and made his way to the firewood pile in the corner of the room. The others watched him closely, their eyes flickering with concern. The storm wasn't going to let up any time soon. The nights were getting colder, and the wind was picking up speed. Elias took a deep breath, his hand resting on the stack of logs. The fire was the only thing keeping them alive now. Elias moved deliberately, his every motion controlled. He chopped another log into smaller pieces and tossed it into the stove, watching as the flames leapt up in response. He knew they were running out of time, but for now the fire burned strong, and as long as it did, so would they. The storm had taken on a life of its own, and Elias had learned long ago to respect the way the wilderness spoke to those who paid attention. He had lived through enough winters to recognize the subtle signs that told him what was coming next. The shift in the wind, the way the snow began to fall heavier in certain patterns, the way the trees began to bend with the weight of the snow. It wasn't just the cold that could kill a man in the mountains. It was the way the storm would work its way into your bones, wear you down, and catch you off guard when you least expected it. Elias had been sitting by the fire listening to the storm's fury outside when the first sign came. It wasn't the wind, which howled like a banshee, or the constant crackling of the snow against the walls of the cabin. It was the silence, the kind of silence that meant something was wrong. He stood up from his chair and walked to the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered into the swirling white chaos outside. The snow had stopped falling for a moment, the wind had died down, and the air was eerily still. Elias had learned that this was often the moment before the worst of the storm would hit, a deceptive lull that masked the danger lurking just beyond. He listened carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Snowfall would obscure the landscape, but his trained senses could feel the subtle shift in the air. He could hear the snow underfoot, a gentle, almost imperceptible sound as it compacted beneath the pressure of a hidden weight. The others, huddled around the fire, didn't notice the change. They were too tired, too consumed by the warmth and the exhaustion of the storm, to pay attention to the finer details of the wilderness. But Elias had always listened to the land in this way. It was a skill honed over decades of survival, a way to know when something was coming, even if you couldn't see it. He knew that nature didn't just attack from one direction, it came in waves. It tested your endurance and your awareness. Elias turned and faced the others, his face hard with resolve. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Get your things together. We'll need to conserve what we have. If the storm shifts, it could be worse than we thought." There was a moment of hesitation, of confusion, in the eyes of those who had sought shelter in his cabin. They didn't understand what Elias was hearing, what he was sensing, but they trusted him, and without a word, they began to gather their things, preparing for whatever lay ahead. As Elias stepped outside into the now quiet storm, the world seemed suspended in a frozen silence. The snow had stopped falling, but the weight of what was to come still hung in the air. He could feel the pressure building, the storm holding its breath. It was as if the land itself was waiting, watching. The wind began to pick up again, sharper now, the snow falling in dense sheets. Elias knew they had little time. The storm was far from over, and it was about to test them all in ways they hadn't expected. But Elias had listened to the snow, and he was ready. The storm finally eased its grip on Blackstone, though the heavy silence that followed seemed just as oppressive as the wind. For 3 days the town had been buried under snow, the roofs of the cabins groaning and cracking under the weight. Those who had taken refuge in Elias Merritt's cabin were beginning to feel the toll of the isolation. The fire had kept them warm, but food supplies were dwindling, and their nerves were frayed from the endless cold and darkness. The storm had swept away the last of the town's comfort, leaving only the stark reality of survival. Elias knew the danger wasn't just in the cold, but in the mental strain the storm had placed on everyone. People were beginning to lose hope, to retreat into themselves as the days dragged on. The few times they ventured outside, they returned with no news and no supplies. The roads were still impassable, and the few remaining resources had been buried by the snow. The town had become a ghost town in the span of just a few days. Then, the inevitable happened. The sounds of cracking wood that had echoed through the night had finally stopped. It was a quiet morning when Elias first noticed the difference. The winds had died down, and though the snow continued to fall in soft, relentless sheets, there was an eerie stillness in the air. Elias stepped outside to assess the damage. The valley was still deep in snow, but the storm had passed its peak. As he looked around, he saw what he feared the most, a once thriving town now scattered with the wreckage of cabins that had succumbed to the weight of the storm. One by one, the structures had fallen, and with them, lives were lost. The cabins around him, which had once been warm refuges, now resembled broken carcasses. Roofs torn off, walls collapsed, and splintered timbers scattered in all directions. The first body he found was that of a young woman, her face frozen in an expression of terror, her hand outstretched as though she had reached for something before she was overcome. Elias knew her. She had been a schoolteacher in Blackstone, a bright woman who had dreamed of a future for the town. Now, she was just another victim of the storm's fury. As Elias continued to search the ruins, he found more bodies. A man trapped under the remains of his cabin, his arms stiff with rigor mortis, his body contorted in a final futile struggle for freedom. Another woman clutching her child to her chest, both of them frozen in a tragic embrace. The death toll was rising, and Elias knew there would be more to find. The storm had taken lives, stolen futures, and left Blackstone in ruins. Elias didn't let himself dwell on the loss, but the sight of so much death weighed heavily on his heart. The people of Blackstone had trusted him, they had relied on him for their survival, and now they were paying the price for their misplaced faith in a world that didn't care about their lives. But even in the face of this devastation, Elias couldn't afford to stop. The town was still alive, and he had to keep moving forward for the ones who were left. The days following the storm were filled with a quiet, heavy sense of mourning. Elias could see it in the eyes of the survivors, the pain of loss, the grief of what had been taken from them. They gathered in his cabin, huddling together in the warmth, but their spirits were broken. Many of the town's most trusted members had been lost, and now Elias, the man who had once been mocked for his unorthodox methods, was being looked to as their leader. The tables had turned, and those who had laughed at his cube-shaped cabin now saw it for what it was, a lifeline. Elias had never wanted to be a leader. He had built his cabin for one reason, survival. He wasn't a man driven by ambition or a desire for power. He was simply a man who understood the wilderness, who knew how to survive in the harshest of conditions. But now, as the storm receded and the survivors came to him with questions, he realized that his knowledge was the only thing left that could help them rebuild. It didn't happen all at once. At first, they were reluctant to follow him, hesitant to trust a man who had spent so many years alone in the wilderness. But Elias had earned their respect with his actions, with his ability to keep them alive during the storm. He hadn't just built a cabin that survived the freeze, he had proven that his methods could save lives. As the days turned into weeks, word of Elias's success began to spread. One by one, the survivors came to him asking for guidance. They wanted to know how to build a cabin like his, one that could withstand not just the storms of winter, but the harsh reality of life in the wilderness. Elias shared what he knew, never hesitating, never asking for anything in return. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He just wanted to ensure that no one else had to suffer the same fate as those who had perished in the storm. Gradually, Elias became something more than just a survivor. He became the founder of a new way of life in Blackstone, a leader whose wisdom and practical knowledge would guide the town for years to come. People began to look to him for answers, not just on how to survive, but how to thrive. The cabins that were rebuilt were stronger than ever, and the town began to flourish again. Elias never took credit for the transformation of Blackstone. He remained the quiet, solitary man he had always been, but the town no longer saw him as the eccentric outsider. He had gone from being a fool to being the man they trusted with their lives. The cube-shaped cabin that had once drawn ridicule was now the symbol of a new era, a testament to Elias's foresight, resilience, and quiet strength. And though Elias never sought recognition, he could not help but feel a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had changed the course of Blackstone's future. His legacy, built one log at a time, would endure long after he was gone. Spring arrived slowly, like a hesitant guest, bringing with it a fragile warmth that melted the snow and revived the frozen earth. The survivors of Blackstone ventured out into the thawing valley, their movements tentative as they surveyed the damage left by the storm. The town was quiet now, but there was a palpable sense of renewal in the air. The once buried cabins were now exposed, their remains scattered across the land. But amidst the destruction, there was also life. The survivors, stronger and more determined than before, began rebuilding. Elias watched from his cabin as the town slowly came back to life. He didn't seek out thanks or recognition, but the grateful glances from those around him were enough. They didn't need to say anything. Their actions spoke louder than words ever could. One by one, the townsfolk began to apply the lessons they had learned from Elias. The cube-shaped cabins sprang up, each one sturdier than the last. Blackstone was slowly transforming, becoming a place built not just for survival, but for resilience. As Elias sat by his fire, watching the thaw unfold, he knew his work had just begun. But for now, the land was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Years passed, and the legacy of Elias Merritt's cube-shaped cabin endured. Blackstone grew, its new homes built on the principles he had taught. The town became known for its resilience, and travelers passing through often stopped to marvel at the sturdy cabins that dotted the valley. Elias never asked for recognition, but the respect he had earned was undeniable. The cabins he had built had withstood more than just the storm. They had withstood the test of time. And though Elias left Blackstone in 1844 to seek a quieter life, his influence remained etched in the town's bones. When he returned to the valley in his later years, he found that his cabin was still standing, though weathered by time. People still spoke of him, not as a pioneer or a hero, but as a man who had simply done what needed to be done. His name had become synonymous with survival and ingenuity, not because he sought fame, but because his work had saved lives. The shape of his cube cabin remained a symbol of his quiet strength, a testament to the power of thoughtful design and the lasting impact one man could have on a community.